June 14th, 1837. The Kissimmee River, territory of Florida. The air is a wet cloth pressed to your face. Before the sun has burned through the horizon's haze, the world is a palette of gray and deep liquid green. It is not quiet. The silence of the pre-dawn swamp is a living thing, a chorus of insect thrumming, the guttural call of a hidden heron, the heavy plop of something unseen sliding from a muddy bank into the black water. But piercing this ancient rhythm is a new sound, a sound of alien industry. It's the rhythmic iron cough of a steam engine. Chunk, chunk, It's a mechanical heartbeat in a world of flesh and blood, a sound that does not belong. You are standing on the forward deck of the United States Army river steamer, the Okeechobee. The deck planks are slick with a dew so heavy it's like a fresh coat of rain. The air smells of wood smoke, hot metal, river mud, and decay. It's a miasma that clings to the back of the throat. Two tall black smokestacks rise amidships, trailing plumes of gray-black smoke that stain the pristine morning sky and fall back down to coat every surface in a fine layer of soot. A large paddle wheel on the stern churns the tannin-stained water into a muddy froth, the only real sign of the vessel's forward progress through the oppressive stillness. Leaning against the forward railing is First Lieutenant Elias Vance of the 4th U.S. Infantry. He is a man made for parade grounds and fortified walls, not this suffocating wilderness. His dark blue wool uniform, already showing patches of dampness, is too hot, too heavy, a magnet for the swarms of biting flies that dance in the air. He holds a brass spyglass, but it remains capped. There is nothing to see but the shifting walls of fog that drift like ghosts between the monolithic cypress trees lining the riverbanks. Their roots, gnarled and knotted like the knuckles of drowned giants, claw at the water's edge. Spanish moss hangs from their branches in great funereal curtains, obscuring whatever lies within the shadows. Vance's mission, like the war itself, is one of attrition and frustration. For 2 years, the United States has been trying to force the Seminole people from this land, their ancestral home, and relocate them to reservations west of the Mississippi. But Florida is not a conventional battlefield. It is a fortress of swamp, sawgrass, and fever, and the Seminole are its masters. They do not fight in lines or stand for pitched battles. They are specters. They strike from the shadows and vanish back into the water and the grass, leaving behind only fear and confusion. General Thomas Jessup's strategy is now one of total war, to hunt them, to find their hidden villages, to destroy their crops, and to break their will by making the very land that sustains them uninhabitable. And the Okeechobee is the newest weapon in that strategy. She is a marvel of American engineering, a shallow draft sidewheeler designed specifically for these labyrinthine waterways. Her boiler can propel her against the current. Her decks can carry 50 soldiers and a small brass cannon, and her steam whistle can shriek with a terrifying authority. In the minds of the men in Washington and St. Augustine, she is the key that will unlock this impossible landscape, a machine to conquer nature itself. To Lieutenant Vance, however, she is a slow, loud, and suffocatingly hot iron cage. He lowers his gaze from the impenetrable trees to the men on his deck. They are listless, drained by the humidity and the constant, nerve-shredding tension. Some lean against the railings, their Springfield muskets held loosely, their gazes vacant. Others huddled near the boiler housing, seeking a dry heat to ward off the damp chill, despite the oppressive temperature. They are boys from Ohio and Pennsylvania, recruited with promises of adventure, now pale-faced and gaunt, their thoughts consumed by malaria, venomous snakes, and the unseen enemy whose eyes they feel upon them from the shore at all hours. Their uniforms are stained, their leather accoutrements green with mold. The pilot, a civilian contractor named Silas Croft, stands at the large spoked wheel in the pilot house above. He is a wiry, sunburnt man who has spent 20 years on Florida's rivers, and his face is a mask of intense concentration. He navigates not by chart, but by the memory of 1,000 submerged sandbars, cypress knees, and deadfall snags that could rip the bottom out of a vessel like this. He chews tobacco slowly, his only communication a series of sharp hand signals to the helmsman and the occasional pull on the cord that sends a command to the engine room below. Down in that infernal space, two men work in the hellish glow of the firebox. They are the stokers, stripped to the waist, their bodies slick with a mixture of sweat and coal dust. With rhythmic, practiced movements, they shovel pine logs and coal into the roaring furnace that powers the beast. The air is thick with the smell of burning pitch and hot oil. The noise is a deafening clang of metal and the constant hungry roar of the flames. The chief engineer, a man named McCready, with soot permanently etched into the lines of his face, watches the pressure gauges with a hawk's intensity. He knows better than anyone the delicate balance between power and destruction that exists within the riveted iron plates of the boiler. He knows this engine was not designed for the sustained, high-pressure pursuit its military commanders might demand of it. On the deck, Lieutenant Vance taps his fingers on the brass railing. Impatience gnaws at him. They have been patrolling this stretch of the Kissimmee for 3 days and have seen nothing but alligators and egrets. The Seminole know they are coming. They can hear the thump, thump, thump of the paddle wheel for miles. They can see the smoke long before the boat rounds the bend. This machine, designed for pursuit, feels more like a parade float announcing its own presence. The Seminoles simply melt away before it. He feels like a fool leading this expensive, smoke-belching monster on a ghost hunt. He unslings the spyglass and finally raises it to his eye, sweeping it across the eastern bank. The glass magnifies the suffocating density of the vegetation. He sees the intricate webs of spiders, glistening with dew. He sees the waxy green leaves of mangroves, the pale spectral flowers of a swamp orchid. He sees everything except what he is looking for. No movement, no sign of human life. It is a landscape that seems utterly primordial, untouched. And yet he knows they are there. This knowledge is an itch under his skin. They are watching. Every soldier on this boat feels it. It is in the way the birds fall silent as they pass, the way the shadows seem to deepen in the cypress groves. One of his men, a young private named Miller, shifts his weight nervously. "Anything, Lieutenant?" His voice barely a whisper, as if too afraid to disturb the oppressive quiet. Vance lowers the spyglass, the frustration evident in the tightness of his jaw. "Nothing, Private. Nothing but bugs and mud." He turns to look down the length of his vessel. It seems so powerful, so dominant, a floating fort armed with 50 rifles and a cannon. Yet out here, it feels fragile, vulnerable. It is tethered to the deep channel of the river. 100 feet to the left or right, in the shallow marshes and flooded forests, the boat is useless, and that is where the enemy lives. He remembers the words of a captured Miccosukee elder a month prior. The old man, withered and defiant even in chains, had looked at a sketch of a steamboat and had not been impressed. Through a reluctant translator, he had said, "Your fire canoe is strong, but it is fat and stupid. It must walk on one path, the people. We are the water. We have no path, so we are everywhere." Vance had dismissed it as the primitive ramblings of a defeated man. Now, surrounded by this endless, pathless water world, the words echo in his mind with unsettling clarity. The Okeechobee is a giant, chained to its single path. He stares into the thick green wall of the swamp, and for the first time he feels a profound, chilling sense of doubt. His machine of war is not an invader here. It is a trespasser, and the ancient silent wilderness is watching, waiting for it to make a mistake. The sun begins to climb higher in the sky, a pale hazy disk, and the fog begins to thin, revealing the river in all its vast, indifferent, and menacing beauty. The hunt was on, but Vance was beginning to suspect he wasn't the hunter. He was the bait. The morning sun, now a relentless white disk in the sky, began to burn away the last vestiges of fog. The world resolved itself into sharp, humid focus. The river widened here, becoming a vast, shallow lake dotted with small islands of sawgrass and mangrove. The heat intensified, radiating up from the water, down from the sky, and out from the boat's own iron heart. The soldiers, no longer chilled, now sweated profusely, their wool uniforms becoming instruments of torture. The rhythmic chunk, hush of the engine was a maddeningly monotonous metronome, counting down the wasted hours. Lieutenant Vance paced the foredeck, his boots leaving dark, damp prints on the wood. He had ordered the men to stay alert, but their vigilance was dulled by the heat and the monotony. Their eyes scanned the same impenetrable walls of vegetation, the same shimmering surface of the water. Hope of finding their quarry was beginning to curdle into the familiar resignation that defined this war. Another day, another fruitless patrol. It was Silas Croft, the civilian pilot, who saw it first. His eyes, accustomed to spotting the subtle disturbances on the water's surface that betrayed a submerged log or a sandbar, caught something else. It was a flicker of movement, unnatural and fleeting, a mile ahead where the wide water began to narrow again into a complex channel. He didn't shout. He simply reached out and placed a hand on the shoulder of the lookout, a corporal named Davies stationed in a small crow's nest atop the pilot house. "Up ahead," Croft said, his voice a low rumble, "bearing 1 o'clock. See it?" Corporal Davies, a farm boy from Kentucky with keen eyes, squinted, shielding his face from the glare. He saw nothing at first, just the blinding reflection of the sun on the water. Then he saw it too. It wasn't much, a thin, dark line, moving with impossible speed and silence across the open water, heading for the shelter of the distant mangroves. It too small to be a log, too deliberate to be debris. "Contact!" Davies' voice cracked with a mixture of excitement and tension. "Canoes, sir! Single man, moving fast!" The word shot through the lethargic atmosphere of the Okeechobee like a jolt of electricity. Men who had been slumping against the railings snapped to attention, their hands tightening on their muskets. Vance spun around, raising his spyglass in an instant. He found the vessel, a tiny speck in the lens. It was a Seminole dugout, long and impossibly narrow, like a sliver of wood shaved from a log. A single figure stood in the stern, wielding a long pole that disappeared into the water and reappeared with a powerful, fluid grace. The canoe wasn't being paddled, it was being pushed, gliding over the shallow water with a speed that was deceptive from this distance. "By God," Vance breathed, a grim smile finally breaking across his face. This was it. Not a whole band, not a village, but it was something. A scout, a hunter, a warrior, a target, a source of intelligence, a victory. "Mr. Croft," Vance bellowed, his voice carrying over the sound of the engine. "Full steam! Bring us alongside that vessel!" Croft spat a stream of tobacco juice over the side. "Full steam in open water's one thing, Lieutenant. That channel he's making for up ahead ain't marked. It gets tight and it gets shallow." "I don't care if you scrape the paint off her," Vance shot back, his eyes still glued to the spyglass. "Engineer!" he roared, turning toward the engine room hatch. "McGrady, give me everything you got. I want this vessel moving like a racehorse." Below deck, in the suffocating heat of the engine room, McGrady heard the command relayed through the speaking tube. He exchanged a grim look with his stokers. "You heard the lieutenant," he grunted. "Feed the beast." The stokers went to work with a renewed, frantic energy. The firebox doors were thrown open, bathing the small room in an incandescent heat. They heaved log after log into the roaring furnace, followed by shovels of coal that made the flames hiss and leap. The fire's roar intensified, and the iron walls of the boiler began to vibrate with a new, higher frequency. On deck, the rhythmic chunk, hush of the engine accelerated into a frantic chunk, hush, chunk, hush. The twin smokestacks belched a thick column of black smoke, and the large paddle wheel at the stern began to churn the water with furious violence. The Okeechobee was awake. She was a predator unleashed. Aboard the dugout, Chalo felt the change before he saw it. He didn't need to look back. He felt it in the water, a deep, shuddering vibration that traveled through the cypress hull of his canoe and up the 16-foot pole into the palms of his hands. The sound of the fire canoe, which had been a distant, steady heartbeat, was now a growing, angry roar. He knew he had been seen. He was young, but he was a man forged by this war and this land. His body was lean and hard, his skin the color of river clay. He wore only a deerskin breechclout and a single heron feather tied in his black hair. His focus was absolute. There was no panic, only a cold, clear assessment of the situation. He was carrying vital information about the steamer's patrol route back to a hidden camp where 20 other families, mostly women, children, and elders, were hiding. His capture would not just be his own death, it would be a death sentence for them all. He had grown up in these canoes. He had learned to pole one through a flooded forest before he had learned to shoot a rifle. The canoe, named Oshki, the new one, was an extension of his own body. His father and uncles had crafted it from a single massive cypress log felled during a full moon, hollowed out with fire and adze over many weeks. It was barely wider than his own shoulders, a design born of necessity. It was tippy and unstable to the uninitiated, but to a master like Chalo, its narrow beam was its greatest asset. It had almost no draft, allowing it to skim over water that would barely cover a man's ankles, and with less surface area touching the water, it had less friction, making it incredibly fast. He gave one quick glance over his shoulder. The fire canoe was no longer a distant smudge of smoke. It was a monster, growing larger by the second, its black hull and churning wheel throwing up a wake that rocked his small craft. He could see the dark blue shapes of the soldiers lining its railings. He saw the glint of the sun on the officer's spyglass. They were coming for him. Chalo turned his gaze forward, toward the mouth of the mangrove channel less than half a mile away. In the open water, the fire canoe's power was absolute. It was a simple equation of force and distance. But in the labyrinth ahead, the rules would change. The chase was not just about speed, it was about knowledge. The soldiers had maps, but Chalo had the water itself in his memory. He knew every turn, every half-submerged log, every oyster bed that could tear a hole in a wooden hull. He had to get there. He changed his rhythm. His poling became deeper, more powerful. He wasn't just pushing against the muddy bottom anymore, he was reading it. Each thrust of the pole told him the depth, the consistency of the mud, the presence of roots. It was a language he understood better than words. The cypress canoe surged forward, a living arrow skimming across the surface. The wind hissed along its fire-hardened sides. The wind whipped the feather in his hair. Behind him, the roar of the machine grew louder, a sound of pure, relentless, industrial fury. The race had begun.
The Okeechobee was now at a speed its builders had never intended. The hull plates groaned under the strain, and a high-pitched whine emanated from the steam pipes. The deck vibrated so intensely that the soldiers had to brace themselves against the railings. Lieutenant Vance stood at the bow, a grimace of triumph fixed on his face, the wind tearing at his uniform. The sheer power of the vessel was intoxicating. He watched through his spyglass as the distance to the dugout canoe began to shrink. "We're gaining," he shouted to Croft, his voice filled with predatory glee. "We're gaining on the devil!" Silas Croft didn't reply. His knuckles were white on the spokes of the wheel. His eyes darted back and forth between the fleeing canoe and the rapidly approaching maw of the mangrove channel. He was pushing his vessel harder than ever before into a stretch of water he didn't know, and every instinct he had honed over 2 decades screamed that this was reckless. The deep, safe channel of the river had given way to a wide, shallow lake, and the depth could change in an instant. On the main deck, the soldiers felt the thrill of the chase. This was better than the monotonous patrol. This was action. This is what they had joined the Army for. Sergeant Marcus Thorne, a barrel-chested veteran of the Black Hawk War, moved among the men, his voice a low growl. "Rifles at the ready. Pick your targets. Lead 'em by a foot for every 10 yards. Don't waste your powder." The range was still too great for an accurate shot, over 400 yards, but that didn't stop a few of the younger, more excitable soldiers. The first shot cracked from the starboard side, the report sharp and loud in the open air. A puff of white smoke billowed away on the wind. The musket ball skipped across the water, hundreds of feet wide of the mark. Vance lowered his spyglass, irritated. "Hold your fire until I give the command," he barked. "You'll do nothing but warn him." The warning, of course, was absurd. The roar of the steam engine was a warning that could be heard for miles. The command was about discipline, about the controlled application of violence that was the hallmark of a professional army. Jalot heard the gunshot, the sound, a faint pop over the churning of the water behind him. He didn't flinch. His entire being was focused on a single task: propulsion. His movements were a perfect repeating cycle of muscle and will. Reach, plant, push, recover. The long 16-foot cypress pole was his third arm. He would reach far forward, plunging the forked tip into the shallow bottom. He would plant it firmly in the muck and sand. Then he would walk his hands down the pole, transferring the entire weight and strength of his body into a powerful, explosive push that sent the sleek dugout gliding forward. Before the canoe lost momentum, the pole was already recovered, swinging through the air in a silent arc, ready for the next plant. It was brutally demanding work. His shoulders, back, and legs burned with the effort. Sweat poured from his body, stinging his eyes. But it was a fire he had known his whole life. It was the fire of the hunt, the fire of travel, the fire of survival. He could maintain this pace for hours if needed. He dared another glance back. The sight was terrifying. The fire canoe was a behemoth, a charging black bull, its bow wave a spreading V of white foam. It was closer now, much closer. He could clearly make out the individual figures of the soldiers, their dark blue uniforms a stark, unnatural color against the greens and browns of the swamp. He could see the officer at the front, a spyglass raised to his eye, pointing directly at him. They were less than 300 yards behind, and the gap was still closing. The machine's brute force was overpowering his human endurance. "Range, Sergeant," Vance yelled. 250 yards and closing, sir," Thorne called back. "First rank, present." A line of 20 soldiers along the forward railing brought their Springfield muskets to their shoulders. The metal of the locks clicked in unison. "Aim at the man. A disabled canoe is useless to us if the operator is gone." Vance's orders were cold, practical. He wanted the man alive for interrogation if possible, but he would not risk his escape. Jalot knew what was coming. He could see the line of rifles pointing at him like a row of skeletal fingers. He could not afford to stay in a straight line. He pushed hard to the right, then sharply to the left, poling with a frantic, zigzagging rhythm. He presented a moving, unpredictable target. The dugout, responsive as a living creature, danced across the water. "Fire!" Vance's command was swallowed by the roar of 20 muskets firing as one. A cloud of dense white smoke erupted from the bow of the Okeechobee, momentarily obscuring the target. The air filled with the sharp, acrid smell of burnt gunpowder. 20.69 caliber lead balls screamed across the water. They raised little waterspouts around the dugout, a deadly rainstorm in a 10-yard circle. One ball struck the stern of the canoe with a heavy thwack, gouging a long splinter from the fire-hardened cypress, but failing to penetrate. Another hissed past Chalot's ear, so close he felt the whisper of its passage. He did not slow. The nearness of death only sharpened his focus. He pulled with a desperate, burning intensity. The entrance to the mangrove labyrinth was now just 100 yards away. It looked like a solid green wall, but he knew that within it lay a network of hidden rivers, a world where the fire canoe could not follow. Aboard the Okeechobee, the soldiers were frantically reloading, their hands moving with practiced speed. They pulled paper cartridges from their belts, tore them open with their teeth, poured the powder down the barrels, and rammed the lead balls home. "Second rank, present," Sergeant Thorne yelled, as the first rank moved back to reload. Another line of rifles was leveled. "Fire!" Vance's command again. Another volley roared out, another cloud of smoke, another swarm of lead bees buzzing around the dugout. This time, Chalot felt a searing pain in his left shoulder. A musket ball had grazed him, tearing a hot furrow through skin and muscle. Blood, dark and shocking, welled up and ran down his arm, mingling with the sweat. The pain was a sharp, clarifying shock. He gritted his teeth, ignoring it, his rhythm unbroken. Reach, plant, push, recover. He was almost there. 50 yards. The shadows of the mangroves beckoned to him, promising shelter, promising survival. Behind him, the steam engine shrieked, the paddle wheel pounded, and the soldiers prepared a third volley. It was a race between the Industrial Revolution and a single man's will, fought with iron, steam, muscle, and wood on the shimmering, indifferent surface of the ancient river.
Chalot shot past the first line of mangroves like an arrow loosed from a bow. The world changed instantly. The blinding, open glare of the river was replaced by a cool, green-tinted twilight. The roar of the pursuing steamer was suddenly muffled, diffused by the dense curtain of vegetation. He was inside the labyrinth. The channel here was no wider than 30 feet, a winding corridor of dark water flanked by impenetrable walls of mangrove roots and cypress knees. The canopy overhead was so thick that only scattered daggers of sunlight pierced through, dappling the water's surface. The air was thick, still, and heavy with the smell of wet earth and blooming night jasmine. The oppressive noise of the chase gave way to the swamp's own intimate chorus, the buzzing of insects, the splash of a turtle diving from a log, the mournful cry of a limpkin. But there was no time for relief. The blood from his shoulder was a hot, sticky stream down his back. The pain was a dull, insistent throb. He knew the Okeechobee would not simply give up. He could hear it now, the sound of its engine echoing strangely in the enclosed space, punctuated by the sharp crack of branches and the grating screech of its iron hull scraping against the submerged cypress trunks that lined the narrow passage. The beast was following him in. Aboard the steamer, the triumphant mood had evaporated, replaced by a tense, claustrophobic anxiety. Lieutenant Vance stood at the bow, his hands gripping the railing, his face a mask of frustration. He could no longer see the dugout. It had vanished around a bend up ahead. All he could see was the endlessly twisting channel. "Damn it, Croft, where is he?" Vance snapped. "He's in his house now, Lieutenant," Silas Croft replied, his voice strained. He was wrestling with the wheel, his entire body tensed as he tried to guide the 60-foot, 50-ton vessel through a channel that was, in places, barely wider than the boat itself. The broad paddle wheel at the stern kept striking the banks, sending shuddering vibrations through the hull and kicking up showers of mud and splintered wood.
"This ain't a river. This is a deer trail with water in it." The soldiers who had been cheering moments before were now silent, their muskets held at the ready. They peered nervously into the tangled gloom on either side. The swamp, which had been a distant feature on the horizon, was now pressing in on them, close enough to touch. They could see cottonmouth snakes coiled on low-hanging branches, their white mouths gaping in silent warning. They could see the unblinking yellow eyes of alligators watching them from the muddy banks. The familiar superiority they felt on the open deck of their floating fortress was gone. Here they were slow, clumsy, and exposed. Every dark shadow, every rustle in the leaves could be an ambush. "McCready!" yelled Vance down the speaking tube. "Half steam! For God's sake, man, slow it down before we're grounded." The engine's frantic pounding slowed to a more cautious, labored rhythm. The progress of the Okeechobee became a torturous crawl. The hull emitted a continuous, nerve-wracking shriek of metal on wood as it scraped along the channel's edges. At one point, the boat came to a dead stop, its bow wedged firmly between two massive cypress knees. The engine strained, the paddle wheel churned uselessly, digging a deep hole in the muddy bottom. "Reverse! Reverse engines!" Croft bellowed, sweat beading on his forehead. The engine coughed, shuddered, and the paddle wheel began to turn in the opposite direction. With a great groaning tear of wood, the Okeechobee pulled itself free, leaving deep scars in the ancient cypress. They had to proceed at a snail's pace. Meanwhile, Chalo was widening the gap. This was his world. He pulled not with frantic speed, but with a quiet, efficient confidence. He knew this waterway as well as he knew the lines on his own hand. He navigated the tight turns with a subtle shift of his weight, guiding the dugout with an almost telepathic connection. He led the pursuing monster deeper and deeper into the maze. He took a channel that seemed to be a dead end, but he knew that behind a thick curtain of Spanish moss lay a narrow passage, barely 3 feet wide, just enough for his canoe to slip through. He pulled into a small, sunlit lagoon, a hidden clearing in the forest, and for the first time, he allowed himself a moment to rest. His breathing was ragged, and his shoulder was on fire. He quickly tore a strip of cloth from his breechclout and pressed it against the wound to stanch the bleeding. He listened. The sounds of the steamer were now more distant, a low, frustrated rumble punctuated by the crash of branches and the shouted commands of angry men. They were still coming, but they were wounded, slowed, and blind. He was not just fleeing, he was fighting. He was using the land itself as his weapon. The narrow channels, the submerged logs, the tight bends, these were his fortifications. The steamboat, for all its power, was a prisoner of its own size and design. Its strength in the open river was its fatal weakness here. The Seminole elder's words came back to Vance with the force of a physical blow. "Your fire canoe is strong, but it is fat and stupid. It must walk on one path." The soldiers on the Okeechobee were growing more unnerved by the minute. The pursuit had devolved into a slow, grinding struggle against the environment itself. Sergeant Thorne tried to keep their spirits up. "Stay sharp. He's in here somewhere. He can't have gotten far." But his words lacked conviction. They had been in the maze for nearly an hour, and every channel looked the same. It was a disorienting, verdant hell. Vance's patience was gone, replaced by a cold, simmering rage. A rage at the enemy who refused to fight fair, a rage at the land that conspired against him, and a rage at the limitations of his own magnificent machine. He felt the futility of it all, the immense expenditure of resources, manpower, and technology, all being thwarted by one man and a hollowed-out log. "He's leading us in circles," Vance snarled, slamming his fist on the railing. "He's making a mockery of us." Croft, still fighting the wheel, grunted in agreement. "He ain't leading us in circles, Lieutenant. He's leading us to a place we can't go, and we're dumb enough to follow. We pushed this tub much further in here, and we ain't never getting her out." The choice was stark. Admit defeat and retreat,
or risk his vessel and the lives of his men by pushing deeper into the unknown. For Lieutenant Elias Vance, a man whose career was built on aggression and forward momentum, there was only one possible answer: pride, anger, and the desperate need for a victory, any victory, in this damnable war, clouded his judgment. "Damn the risks, Mr. Croft," Vance said, his voice low and dangerous. "We are not turning back. McCready, give me steam. We will flush him out or we will run him down. I don't care if we have to tear this entire swamp apart to do it." The order was given. Deep within the iron hull of the Okeechobee, the stokers once again began to feed the fire, unaware that
The renewed surge of power was felt immediately throughout the Okeechobee. The engine's labored groans deepened into a shuddering roar. The paddle wheel bit into the water with renewed ferocity, and the steamer lurched forward, smashing through smaller branches and grinding against the cypress-lined channel with a terrifying screech of tortured metal. Lieutenant Vance stood braced at the bow, his face set like stone, peering ahead for any sign of his quarry. This was no longer a pursuit. It was an act of brute force demolition. He would flatten a path through this wilderness if he had to. Down in the engine room, the temperature had become unbearable. It was a cramped, sweat-drenched version of hell, illuminated by the pulsating demonic orange glow of the firebox. McCready, his face black with soot and his shirt soaked through, watched his gauges with a growing sense of dread. The needle on the boiler pressure dial was creeping steadily into the red zone. The safety valve, a simple lever weighted to release steam at a certain pressure, was already hissing, letting out small, angry puffs of white vapor. The entire boiler was vibrating violently, the iron plates humming with a terrifying amount of contained energy. "She can't take much more of this, Lieutenant," he yelled up the speaking tube, his voice hoarse. "The pressure's too high. We're running her too hot in this enclosed space with no airflow." The reply that came back down the brass tube was tinny and devoid of sympathy. "I gave you an order, engineer. Maintain speed." McCready slammed the tube back into its holder, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and fury. He looked at his two stokers. They were young men, barely out of their teens, their faces pale beneath the grime, their movements sluggish from the heat and exhaustion. They were running on pure adrenaline, flinging logs into the furnace with a desperate mechanical rhythm. He knew he was asking them, and the boiler, to do the impossible. Every rivet, every seam was being tested to its absolute limit. Meanwhile, Chalo, poling his canoe through a relatively straight stretch of water, heard the change in the fire canoe's sound. The rumble had escalated to a high-pitched, straining scream. The crashing and grinding was louder, more constant. They were coming faster. They were coming with a suicidal recklessness. He pushed harder, his wounded shoulder screaming in protest. He needed to reach the shallows, a place known as the Grassy Water, a vast expanse of sawgrass marsh where the water was only a foot deep. Even the Okeechobee's shallow draft would be no match for it. It was another mile ahead. He wasn't sure he could make it. The Okeechobee rounded a sharp bend, and suddenly there he was. Less than 200 yards ahead, in a straight, clear channel. A clear shot. "There!" Vance roared, a surge of adrenaline washing away his frustration. "Sergeant, volley fire, by ranks. Don't let him reach that next bend." The well-drilled soldiers scrambled to obey. The first rank knelt, the second stood behind them. The chaos of the maze was forgotten, replaced by the familiar, brutal calculus of firepower. Sergeant Thorne's commands cut through the air. Ready! Aim! Fire! The first volley exploded from the deck, but the soldiers were unsteady on the vibrating deck, their hands slick with sweat. The shots went wide, chewing up the water and shredding the mangrove leaves on the banks. Chalo didn't zigzag. He knew he didn't have time. His only hope was pure, straight-line speed. He put his head down and poled with a strength he didn't know he possessed. His entire world narrowed to the feel of the pole in his hands and the sight of the water rushing past the bow of his canoe. Reload! Second rank fire! The second volley was more accurate. Splinters flew from the sides of the dugout. One ball tore through the thin deerskin of Chalo's breech clout, missing his leg by an inch. He felt the deadly whisper of its passage. But he was still moving, a phantom of speed and grace, pulling away. It was in that moment that the Okeeochebee's iron heart began to fail. A seam on a high-pressure steam pipe, stressed beyond its tolerance, finally gave way. It started as a small, almost imperceptible hiss, a sound McCready had been dreading. Within seconds, the hiss became a shrieking jet of superheated steam, blasting into the confined space of the engine room. It was like the roar of a dragon, deafening and terrifying. One of the young stokers caught in the initial blast screamed in agony as the scalding vapor hit his arm. "She's blown a pipe!" McCready roared, grabbing the uninjured stoker and shoving him toward the ladder. Get out! Get out now!" On deck, the effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The engine, starved of pressure, coughed, sputtered, and died. The thunderous pounding of the paddle wheel faltered, slapping the water a few more times before grinding to a halt. The sudden, profound silence was more shocking than the noise it replaced. All that remained was the terrifying, high-pressure scream of escaping steam, which now billowed up from the engine room hatch in a dense white cloud. The Okeeochebee, her forward momentum gone, drifted slowly and silently, coming to rest against the muddy bank with a soft, final sigh. The soldiers stood frozen, their muskets half-loaded, staring in disbelief at the pillar of steam rising from the center of their vessel. The mighty war machine was dead in the water, crippled by its own rage. Lieutenant Vance stood in stunned silence. He watched as the Seminole dugout, now under no threat, continued to move away. He saw the warrior risk a single, fleeting glance back at the stricken steamer. There was no gesture of triumph, no sign of mockery. The man simply turned forward again, and with a few more powerful, unhurried pushes of his pole, disappeared around the final bend, swallowed once more by the green wilderness. The chase was over. The silence that descended upon the Okeeochebee was absolute, broken only by the continued hiss of dying steam and the gentle, indifferent sounds of the swamp, which seemed to rush back in to reclaim the space the machine's noise had occupied. The invader had been silenced. The iron heart was broken.
The steam hissed for another 10 minutes, a mournful dying breath, before finally fading into silence. And then there was only the sound of the swamp, the chirping of crickets, the drone of cicadas, the gentle lapping of water against the silent hull. To the men aboard the Okeechobee, the quiet was deafening, a profound and heavy blanket of failure. The air, no longer filled with wood smoke and engine noise, now carried the rich, loamy scent of the mud they were stuck in. Lieutenant Elias Vance stood motionless at the bow, staring at the empty channel where his enemy had vanished. The adrenaline had drained away, leaving a hollow, bitter residue of defeat. He saw his own reflection in the dark, still water, a man in a filthy, sweat-stained uniform aboard a crippled monument to his own hubris. He had brought the pinnacle of American military technology into the heart of the enemy's fortress, and that enemy, a single man with a stick and a carved log, had led his machine to its own self-destruction. The Seminole warrior hadn't even needed to fight back. He had simply allowed the steamer's own power, its own rage, to become its undoing. Sergeant Thorne approached him quietly. "Sir, the engineer reports a ruptured main steam line. The boiler's intact, but we've no pressure. We're not moving under our own power until it's patched, and McCready says that's a dry dock job. We're hard aground, sir." Vance didn't turn. He just nodded slowly. "Any casualties?" "Private Hitchcock has severe burns on his arm and shoulder, sir. We're tending to him. The other stoker is shaken but unharmed. The rest of the men are accounted for." "Very well, Sergeant," Vance said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Post sentries. Double the watch. We're stranded in the heart of their territory. We'll attempt to pole our way back to the main river at first light. If that fails, we'll send a party overland." The soldiers, their discipline holding despite the shock, moved to their tasks. They looked like castaways on a desert island, their impenetrable fortress now just a vulnerable, stationary target. Every man on board knew that the eyes they had felt on them all morning were surely still there, watching from the shadows, aware of their helplessness. The hunter had become the hunted, trapped in his own ineffective snare. Miles away, Chalo guided his canoe into a hidden waterway, a passage concealed behind a screen of weeping willow branches. It opened into a small, calm lagoon, where a temporary village of chickees, thatched roof dwellings on raised platforms, stood nestled among the cypress trees. It was a place that did not appear on any map. He poled his canoe silently toward the shore, where his wife and an elder were cleaning fish. They looked up, their faces etched with anxiety, which melted into relief upon seeing him. His wife, Nita, ran into the shallow water to help him steady the canoe. She saw the blood on his shoulder and the raw gash, and her hand went to her mouth. "You are hurt," she whispered in their Miccosukee tongue. "It is a scratch from a clumsy animal," Chalo said, his voice weary but steady. He stepped out of the canoe onto the muddy bank, his legs trembling slightly from the hours of exertion. The elder came forward and inspected the wound, his expression grim. He sent a young boy running for moss and medicinal herbs. Chalo looked back in the direction from which he had come. He could no longer hear or see any sign of the fire canoe. "It is dead," he said quietly. "The fire in its belly went out. It is stuck in the crooked river." The news spread through the small camp in hushed tones. It was not a grand victory, not the end of the war, but it was something far more important. It was hope. It was a reaffirmation of their way of life. It was proof that their knowledge, their resilience, and their bond with this land could defeat the invaders' machines. They had survived another day.
The information Chalo carried about the patrol routes was safe, and the families hidden here would have time to move on before another patrol found them. The story of that day would become a legend, told and retold around campfires for generations. It was the story of the canoe that outran the fireboat, the story of how the old ways, the deep knowledge of the water, proved superior to the new ways of iron and steam. The dugout canoe, so often dismissed by the Americans as a primitive, unstable vessel, was shown for what it truly was, a piece of technology perfectly evolved for its environment, a tool of survival so efficient and elegant that it could, in the right hands, outmaneuver a steamship. Back on the immobile Okeechobee, as dusk fell, and the swamp came alive with the sounds of the night, Lieutenant Vance finally allowed himself to sit. He looked at his beautiful, powerful, useless machine. He thought of the reports he would have to write, the humiliation he would have to endure. But more than that, he thought about the warrior in the canoe. He had seen the man's face in his spyglass just for a moment. It was not a face of fear or hate. It was a face of absolute, unyielding concentration. It was the face of a man who was not just in his element, but was an extension of it. The war would grind on for 5 more years. The United States Army, with its limitless resources, would eventually force the removal of most of the Seminole people. But they would never conquer the land, and they would never extinguish the spirit of those who refused to leave, the ancestors of the modern Seminole and Miccosukee tribes who still live in Florida today. That single chase on the Kissimmee River was a microcosm of the entire conflict. It was a clash not just of men, but of philosophies. One believed that nature was an obstacle to be conquered by force and machinery. The other understood that survival depended on becoming one with nature, on listening to its rhythms and using its own strength as your own. On that hot June day in 1837, in the green labyrinth of the Florida swamp, a single cypress dugout, powered by a single man, proved which of those philosophies held true dominion here. The echo of its silent wooden hull, moving through the water, would long outlast the rusting silence of the engine that had tried and failed to run it down.